This week's reading in the Bible plan for the year brings us to Joshua chapters 6 to 24 and John chapters 3 to 7. So we read about the partial conquest of the land of Israel, and we read about the progressing, intensifying ministry of Jesus as well. Now, Joshua can be a hard read. Lots of big questions that I'm sure can be talked about a lot. There's accounts of warfare. There's accounts of lots of discussion of the allotment of the land to the people of Israel. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind when reading through Joshua, and the readings this week will take us from chapter 6 all the way to the end of the book of Joshua and the death of Joshua. Read Joshua with the book of Deuteronomy particularly in mind. So the whole of the story that's happened so far, but particularly the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, Joshua is the first of a block of books from Joshua through to 2 Kings, not including Ruth, that were probably finally put together, shaped in the exile to explain why the exile has happened. So it's an account of the history of Israel, but there's a lot of themes in there of the disobedience of Israel. So we need to read Joshua onwards with Deuteronomy particularly in mind, and think about how that covenant that was established between God and the people plays out throughout the book of Joshua. Think about the promises that were made, promises of God to the people, but also the commitments that were made by the people to God. What about the consequences of obedience and disobedience in that relationship? Well, Joshua tells the story of Israel's conquest of the land, but partial conquest of the promised land, and talks about the distribution of that land between the different tribes of Israel. So it's really important background to a lot of the following story. And there's also a theme of covenant that keeps coming up, and the law of Moses. And towards the end of the book, we read about a renewal of that covenant relationship. And we get these famous words of Joshua where he confronts the people with the need to choose. Are they going to follow God or not? And if they are, then get on with it. And he says, well, whatever you choose, he says in 24 verse 15, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So he confronts the people with that choice of obedience and disobedience. Now, moving on to the book of John, then, we also get a confrontation and a challenge to believe or not believe, to obey or disobey, if you like. So having read the first couple of chapters in the previous week, chapters 3 to 7 in the Gospel of John contain some familiar stories and speeches. Now, again, some things to look out for. Even in chapters 3 and 4, you might want to consider and reflect on a comparison and a contrast between the two main people that Jesus encounters in those chapters. So Nicodemus, a Pharisee, and also a Samaritan woman at the well. We have healing stories. We have speeches. We have Jesus feeding people miraculously. And we have Jesus walking on water. We have Jesus teaching to the amazement of people. And we have an increasing excitement of people as they follow Jesus around, and almost in the people's minds, at least, a sort of a celebrity factor to Jesus, where many, many people are following him around. And we also have an increasing hostility from the authorities, and perhaps those two things are linked. We have one of John's famous I am sayings, where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Not just I give you bread, but I am the bread of life. We also have Jesus talking about his time, his Father's agenda. My time has not yet come, he says. And that idea of time and Jesus' hour is one that crops up again and again in John. So look out for that. I just want to pause for a moment in chapter 6, because although Jesus celebrity status, not that he was seeking that, but that was sort of put upon him by the people, reaches a bit of a climax in chapter 6, and he starts to give some really hard teaching. And actually many people then turn away, maybe because they were only interested in the celebrity of Jesus and not in what he was actually saying and who he actually was. And we read with people leaving, turning away and walking away because of the hard teaching. We read in John 6, 66, from this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And then Jesus says, you do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. And then Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. So again, there's a choice there to be made, to disobey or to obey, to follow or to walk away. And of course, Peter says, what else can we do? Where else can we go? You have the words of eternal life. So there are just a few things to look out for and think about over the coming week.